So now that we've defined variables, let's talk about defining the variables themselves. We call this operational definition or an operational definition of a variable. And the idea here is that we're taking a theory or an idea, so a concept of a variable, a construct, if you will, so agreeableness, number of drinks, etc., and we're bringing it to a reality that we can actually observe. So the process of taking an idea, for example, self-esteem, so we have a theory, we have a concept, we know what we're interested in. We now have to decide how we're going to operationally define it for our specific experiment, our methodology. So for example, our theory might be self-esteem. Our operational definition might be a question, I feel good about myself, on a 1 strongly disagree to a 5 strongly agree scale. Now, as this class progresses, we are going to address a little bit ways that we can make these scales better, ways that we can actually be more certain that we're actually capturing the theory or idea in our reality, our operational definition. But at least initially, we're wanting to think about what it means to operationally define a variable. So again, in this particular case, our operational definition is about taking something from the land of theory, the land of thought, the ideas, etc., and coming up with a way to actually observe it reliably and validly within a study. So our definition in this case, an operational definition, is a definition of a variable in terms of activities, operations, a researcher uses to measure or manipulate it. So in other words, we are defining what is the theory behind it, what are we trying to measure, what is the terminology we're using, but we're also providing how we're specifically going to measure it. What is the activities, the operations that we're going to conduct to either manipulate or measure that variable within a study? And generally, what we're really interested in psychology is constructs, an abstract or general idea inferred from specific instances or observations. So again, think about a lot of the things that we think about as far as human behavior. What's driving it often is internal operations. It's attitudes, it's emotions, it's states of mind. What are those? We can define them, we can talk about them, but we can't directly measure them. We can't put them on a scale. So we're having to come up with an operational definition that allows us to actually measure or manipulate that construct. And the art, if you will, or the science of determining are we actually measuring what we think we're measuring is an entire field of psychology unto itself. So again, our construct can also have, obviously, multiple operational definitions. So if we're thinking of self-esteem, self-esteem could be measured by, for example, an operational definition that simply is a self-report scale. It could be 10 questions about how good you feel about yourself that you're agreeing to on a 1 to 5 scale. We could use an operational definition where we're not asking the person directly about their self-esteem, we're asking their friends and family. So you know this person, you've had experience with them. How would you rate them on self-esteem? Are they high, are they low, or in the medium? We might also think about ways to medically test for self-esteem. So does someone actually get agitated? Do we find an increase in breathing, an increase in galvanic skin response when we put them into stressful situations that challenge their self-esteem? All of these could be valid ways to define or operationally define the construct of self-esteem. And when we're really talking about this, there is a tale, I believe it was actually an Indian folk tale, that's about 3 blind people trying to identify what's blocking their path. And one of them reaches forward and feels, so they're all blind, they can't see, but basically he detects and using his senses of touch to determine there's a large tree in the way. Someone else goes up and goes, "You're wrong, it's not a tree, there's a large wall in the way." And someone else goes, "No, you're both wrong. There was some form of snake in the way." All of them using their sense of touch. And this kind of gets at the idea of operational definitions. No single operational definition is really going to give us the complete picture of a construct. It's going to give us parts. So for instance, some particular operational definition might give us this part. Another one might give us this part. Another part might give this. Another part this. And eventually we start to get the big picture of what we're actually trying to detect. So generally speaking, when we're talking about research methodology, a lot of times people are struck by how many scientific studies are involved about looking at one particular construct. For example, if you go on to any kind of actual academic search site and look up self-esteem, you will find literally tens of thousands of studies that have looked at self-esteem. But you have to realize that they are all looking at a particular part of self-esteem. Their operational definitions of what is self-esteem and what they're trying to predict with self-esteem are often going to be a limited snapshot of what's going on. Not incorrect, but when we're talking about something as complex as human behavior, it often takes many studies for us to start to see meaningful patterns. Much like three blind people trying to identify an elephant blocking their way. So when we talk about the construct, what we're actually interested in psychology of self-esteem, and again, construct is simply a fancy way to talk about a variable, but a variable that we're trying to define with theory and research. That the various operational definitions become indicators of that construct. So I want to make it clear that if it is reliably measurable through technology and through science. For example, if what we're simply looking at is the number of drinks someone has, and each drink is defined as 1 ounce, and they can have one, two, three, four, five, or six. That really is not necessarily a construct. That is the measurement of alcohol consumption. However, if we're applying that study to drinking in general, we may be talking about the construct, alcoholic consumption, defined by the operation, specifically shots of a particular alcoholic drink. So, generally speaking, constructs are what we're talking about, but any particular study, any particular research, any methodology is going to use indicators of that construct. Now, the more complex the study, it may use multiple indicators, but many of them will only choose to use one. We're interested in self-esteem, we're measuring it one way. So you can think about my previous example. We might have a single study that looks at self-esteem through self-report, a separate study that looks at self-esteem based on other report, and finally a third study that looks at self-esteem using medical measures. We could also create a complex study that uses all three of these methods, or even multiple methods beyond three, to basically get a better picture of self-esteem. The problem with that is again, complexity. The more complex the study, the more time and effort it's going to take. So I no longer have someone coming into the lab and completing a 10-item survey. I've got someone coming into the lab, completing a 10-item survey, also submitting themselves to various medical testing, and they're then sending out questionnaires to family members. And until I have all three of those pieces of data, I can't proceed with my study. So will that research study be more valid? Will it be a better representation of self-esteem? Most likely. But will it also be more difficult to complete that study, more costly, and more time consuming? And may I also have a problem with some applicants deciding I'm not willing to go through all of that, which then may also limit my conclusions based on the fact that people are self-selecting out of my study because it's too complex. So each indicator is a fallible reflection of the construct that we're measuring. And that's an important thing to recognize. And that's what also drives so many research studies, is that methodological need to look at this in different ways with different groups of people and different measures and different indicators of the constructs that we're interested in measuring before we can truly start to understand how behavior occurs in people. So again, a dimension might be socioeconomic status. Dimension 1 might be an income. Dimension 2 might be education. So I might have a construct that has multiple indicators. These become dimensions. In other words, the construct itself may not be something that can be measured by a single measure. So when we talk about socioeconomic status, we're talking about two things just in the title: your societal placement and your economic status. So how much money you're making plus how respected is your profession. For example, there are some professions that actually make really good money but are not considered socially very white collar or high level. And there are certain high level positions For example, a lot of positions in various legal firms, I actually know a lawyer who makes very little money, but you'd think they are high social status because they're a lawyer, but they might be lower status because of the actual income they're making. Versus someone, for example, that might be a plumber or a bricklayer who might be lower on that social economic status, their education, kind of the perception of people of the field, but are actually making more money. So a lot of constructs also require multiple dimensions for us to be able to truly understand them. And again, we may find that these various dimensions alter. There may be some dimensions which are higher and other dimensions which are lower. So, for example, we might have someone that's making a lot of money with very low education. We may have someone that's making very little income with very high education. On average, these two things are usually highly correlated, especially in the middle. So not necessarily the extremes. You can definitely find some of the richest people in the world do not have an enormous amount of education. They might have a bachelor's degree. In fact, some of them don't even have that. And you can definitely find some people that have PhDs that are making very little money. I actually had another friend that had a PhD that delivered papers for a living. In other words, they never managed to make that PhD make them income. But on average, we find that for most people, the more education you have, generally the higher your income um, in the real world. And again, we're talking about averages, but most human behavior kind of fits onto what we call basically a distribution matrix. So basically, with very few people scoring extremely lowly, very few people scoring extremely highly, most people in the middle. And that's where we find most of our prediction. So you will always be able to find any psychological theory that we will talk about in this class or any other class that you take on psychology. Recognize that there's always going to be exceptions on both ends of that scale. There are going to be some people that would not be predicted to do well that do very, very well. And there'd be some people that would be predicted to do well that do very, very poorly. But on average, most people do fall into the patterns that we see. For example, generally speaking, those that are very open to new experiences are also much more likely to travel and are much more likely to eat at lots of different restaurants. That's a trend. That is a prediction that can also result in some knowledge about how people actually behave. However, you will find some people that are very open to experience that have just never had the opportunity to travel and haven't. And you'll find some people that are extremely closed to new experiences that because of their job choices or just their position in life have actually traveled a fair amount. So there's always going to be exceptions, and we're not necessarily looking for perfect prediction. We're looking for, on average, does that prediction allow us to make some conclusions about human behavior? So the main point so far of the languages of variables, variables are observations that can take on different values and attributes of the specific values of that variable. Independent variables typically cause something else. It's what is manipulated, or at least is what theoretically should be a causal agent. We believe that it comes first, that it is the why of what's occurring. The dependent variable is affected by that independent variable. It's generally what we're going to measure. And again, theoretically, it's what is coming after the variable. And constructs, which are generally what these variables are, have multiple ways that they can be operationally defined. So let's talk a little bit about a measurement scale. So when we're talking about the numerical assignment of numbers to a variable, that's really what we're talking about with a measurement scale. So we are basically assigning values to an object. So are you willing to permit immigrants to live in your country? Are you willing to permit immigrants to live in your neighborhood? And would you let your child marry an immigrant? This is what is often referred to as an ipsitative scale. In other words, as you agree with each item, you should naturally agree with the items that came before it. So if you would let your child marry an immigrant, we would assume that you would also be willing to let immigrants live in your neighborhood, and you would also be willing to permit immigrants to live in your country. And we're going to assign those objects to numbers. So a measurement scale is the assignment of objects to numbers. And what is the process that we're using? In other words, what is the operational definition? And we're going to use a rule to do this. So our final definition of what is a measurement scale is it's the assignment of objects to numbers according to a consistent rule. So as I said, this particular scale would be considered an ipsitative or cumulative scale. And there's different types of scales that we can use in psychology to measure these constructs. So let's talk about these types of measures. What makes them, both what are they and what actually makes them different from each other for the purposes of quantitative, and a quantitative is just a fancy name for numerical, analysis and descriptive statistics. So first, we're just going to talk about the different ways to gather information about constructs. We can have self-report, and those can be behavioral, cognitive, or affective. So behavioral means we're simply asking someone, how often do you do a certain behavior? If you've ever actually been asked, for example, how often do you drink in a given week? That is a behavioral report. You're reporting on your behavior. How often do you commit a crime in a particular month? How often do you speed in a particular week? Those are all asking you self-report your behavior. Cognitive means you're being asked about your thoughts. How do you like? What do you experience? What are your thoughts on? And affective is basically about your feelings. So not necessarily your opinions, but are you anxious? Are you reactive? Are you angry? Those would be affective. But all of them are going to be simply asking you, how often did you drink? What do you think about this particular opinion? How do you feel right now? The strengths are that these are very easy to collect. Basically, they're self-report. So we can simply just create a survey or an interview where we're asking these questions. The weaknesses are that they're pretty dependent on your willingness to, one, share the information honestly. So for example, if the behavior we're asking about is not socially sanctioned, for example, we're asking about risky sexual behavior, some people may very much lie. And in fact, there's been a fair amount of research in the social psychology literature that shows that we have a tendency to do what's called social desirability. We change our answers, even if it's an anonymous survey, to more fit what we think is the acceptable report of that behavior. So one of the weaknesses is that people will lie. The other weakness is, do they actually know? Do we always know how we're feeling? Do we always know our opinions on particular things? Do we actively remember how many drinks we had last week? These are also additional weaknesses of the self-report method. We can also give tests. So we basically can give people tests. Generally speaking, tests are going to be ability, aptitude or achievement, and personality. So that's generally what we're looking at when we're looking at tests. Now, again, when we're talking about ability tests, there's aptitude and achievement. Aptitude is your ability or your, for example, if we're going to use cognitive ability, aptitude would be, can you learn? How smart are you? Achievement would be, have you learned the material from a particular subject or class? So generally, when we're talking about aptitude, we're often talking about more predictive tests. If you think about the ACT or SAT, if you took those prior to going into college, if you take the GRE going into grad school, those are generally aptitude tests. They're less concerned with what you learned and more concerned with your aptitude towards learning, your ability to learn new information. However, in this class, there's quizzes and exams. Those are achievement tests. We can also look at tests as personality. Personality has become an area where it has been so well researched that most of the time, if we're really interested in personality, we're using a pre-existing test of that personality. So the strengths here, the strengths are, again, easy to actually assess this. We can give out ability tests or personality tests to large numbers of people. Generally speaking, it doesn't take an enormous amount of time or effort for someone to complete one of these tests, and it gives us a fair amount of information. And most of them are already set up to where they naturally have rules for applying a score. So for example, on an achievement test in a class, it's usually going to be scored on a 0% to 100%. 100% means you didn't make any mistakes. You got all the questions right. 70% means you got 70% of them correct. So we have kind of the requirements already built in. So those are some of the strengths. The weaknesses are that we may be missing additional variables. So just because we know someone's personality, then we don't necessarily know how they're going to behave in a particular situation. In fact, generally, when we look at the difference between personality and social psychology or situational psychology, we find that situational psychology often trumps personality. Think about the last time you were in an in-person classroom where there was 100+ people in that classroom, all sitting quietly and all listening to the lecture. I can guarantee you that if we gave individual personality tests, we would find a lot of differences on extroversion versus introversion, on agreeableness, and also on openness to experience. We'd expect that there would be people that in other situations might be loud and gregarious, and some people that in other situations might be very quiet, but everyone's behaving quietly. That means the situation, the understanding that you're supposed to sit there quietly and listen to the lecture, is trumping personality, if you will. So the weaknesses here, again, can get to those same things that we talked about self-report. Do you actually have access? Do you remember this information? But it can also be affected by other things. For example, an achievement test. It's very rare that someone scores an 100 on an achievement test because they 100% knew every question. There was probably a little bit of luck involved. There was probably a few questions that they weren't 100% sure on, but decided this is my answer. And in this particular case, they were right. So there's going to be some error in this. Also, what we're missing in this is there might be other impacts. So we might have someone that normally would have passed or scored very highly on an achievement test, but something horrendous happened in their personal life right before taking the test, which affected their ability to concentrate. So those are some additional weaknesses that we can think about. We can also just look at behavioral measures. So in this case, we're not asking someone to self-report measures. We're actually observing an observable behavior. Some examples here is reaction timing or amount of help. It can be as simple as the number of times someone blinks, their heart rate, their galvanic skin response, how quickly they respond to a various stimuli on a computer. All of those are examples of behavioral measures. So their count data, their electronic data, their medical data. The advantage to behavioral measures is one of the biggest strengths is they don't rely on you actually having access to your own thoughts and feelings. They don't require self-report, and they're reliable. In other words, you can have multiple people look at the same data and always come up with the same number. If you can watch a video and go, that person touched their nose 7 times, everyone agrees they touched their nose 7 times. So those are some of the strengths. The weaknesses is that a lot of times behavioral measures are a few steps further away from the actual construct that we're interested in. So for example, if I'm measuring self-esteem, if I ask you to self-report on self-esteem, assuming you know your own self-esteem and are willing to tell me the truth, that is probably going to be a closer measure of your self-esteem than your heart rate in a stressful situation. I'm having to make several leaps of assumption that my heart rate is a reliable and valid measure of self-esteem. We can also just look at physical measurements. So this isn't behavior. This is things that are beyond even your control or conscious control. These could include weight, galvanic skin response. I know I used that in the previous example, but generally it depends on how we're using it. But again, these are things that are more physically measured. The advantages here again is reliability. There is no you don't even necessarily need to observe. So think about number of times someone touches their nose in an experiment. There may still be some disagreement. Like, what if someone kind of gets close and scratches near the nose but doesn't touch it? So you've got 3 different observers. 2 of them say they touch the nose 7 times. 1 of them says only 6 times. You might have to actually ask them, what are you looking at? What are you seeing? Even though they're all watching the same video. If we have someone jump on the scale and it says 190 pounds, everyone that sees that scale is going to see 190 pounds. So we're even looking at less error with physical measurements. The weakness is similar to behavioral measures. It's even further away, most likely, from the construct that we're interested in. So for example, if you're using weight to infer how active the person is, their exercise, or even personality traits as far as openness to exercise, there's going to be a lot of variance in that weight may not be capturing. So again, we're getting further and further away from hopefully a good representation of the construct. That doesn't mean that there isn't value to physical measurements. A lot of good studies in psychology have used all of these methods to get at, again, different parts of the elephant as we're studying a particular phenomenon. So measuring importance, it does influence validity and reliability. The more sensitive, the more reliable, and so the more valid in general. So generally speaking, what we find, and we're going to talk about validity and reliability coming up, is that validity is reliant on reliability. In other words, what we're assuming is that we are measuring stable constructs. Constructs that should not change much over time, from time 1 to time 2. And therefore, the more reliably we can measure something, the same way basically every time I measure this, I'm coming up with a very similar score for the same person. And the more sensitive it is, in other words, it's on a 1 to 7 scale or a 1 to 10 scale, generally that means it's more reliable, which opens the door to more valid. The appropriateness, and it also affects what type of measurement affects the appropriate type of statistical analysis, depending on in part on the type of the measurement scale. So when we start talking about what we can do with these numbers, we have to actually start asking, how are we measuring it? What is the rule? And that's going to get into another whole level of the importance of measurement. So I'm going to start now on internal and external validity, and we'll discuss that more in the next lecture. But internal validity is simply, can the results of an experiment be attributed to the manipulation of the independent variable? So when we're talking about internal validity, all we're saying is within this particular study, prediction, or measurement, can we be certain that the actual results are due to what we did in the study? That's internally valid. So for example, if I randomly assign people to a study guide or not study guide situation, and those with the study guide scored significantly better on a final test, that would be high internal validity. External validity is, can the results of the experiment be generalized outside of the study itself? Does this actually mean, for example, that the presence of study guides in any class, in any university, with any students is going to result in better performance? External validity rarely can be assessed by a single study. It's usually one of the reasons we see lots of different studies looking at things in different ways. So for example, if I had multiple studies that looked at the use of study guides, different types of study guides at different universities, some of them in grade school, some of them at preschool, some of them at college, some of them at high school, some of them on the East Coast, some of them on the West Coast, and all of them were finding a positive impact of study guides, then I would start to get to being able to talk about external validity. The results of this experiment and other experiments can be generalized. No type of research design is immune to the threats to internal and external validity, and be aware of these threats and avoid them if possible, but be recognizing that there is no way to make a perfect study. The higher the focus on internal validity, I absolutely know that I manipulated this variable in a way that results in an outcome, temporal precedence. Also, the harder it's going to be to do external validity. In other words, that study, people are going to say, well, it was artificial. People knew they were being manipulated. People knew they were in a study, and that's why you found the results. Why something that has high external validity, I had a lot of different campuses, a lot of different students, and a lot of different types of study guides. Well, then do you really know that it was the study guides that resulted in your outcome? Or was it that they were being experimented on? Or was it that the universities you chose? So again, generally speaking, think of internal validity and external validity almost as a seesaw. If you have high internal validity, you're probably going to have lower external validity. If you have high external validity, you're probably going to have lower internal validity. And it's another reason why we see multiple studies, because no one study is going to have this well done. But if we see a fair amount of studies with high internal validity find an effect, and a fair amount of studies with high external validity find that effect as well, it starts to build an argument for a trend.